to the east of New Guinea is a string of islands. Some of these islands were bases in the war in the Pacific in World War II. A lot of the stories we have from these islands over the years are wildly different, to say the least. You tend to get these stories of incredibly idyllic places with beautiful women, semi-naked, by the beach, or otherwise they're disease-ridden dark forests filled with cannibals and flesh-eating plants. Of course, some of these stories are wildly exaggerated, and some of them are actually true. About 25 years ago, a young Tim Flannery went to these islands. He climbed extinct volcanoes. He met with tribal chiefs and bargained with them. He pushed his way into secret caves filled with unimaginable filth, as you'll soon hear. Tim Flannery was looking for monkey-faced bats. He was looking for spotted cuscusses and giant native rats, the mammals of these islands, which are the product of unique evolutionary forces. Because these islands have been semi-isolated, they're like little worlds all to their own. Tim Flannery, scientist, explorer, has written a rollicking memoir of his passionate youth called Among the Islands, Adventures in the Pacific, and it's full of shaggy dog tales, which are the perfect thing for this hour. Hello, Tim.
Hi, Richard. How you doing?
How do you see this period of your life?
Well, I look back on it with great fondness. You know, it was very much a period when my responsibilities were different, and I must say probably less difficult and onerous than they are now, and where I had this opportunity to do something completely unique. You know, no one had ever gone out to that great arc of islands and documented what lived there. So for me as a young biologist, this was the great opportunity to go and make a mark in the world, you know, and visit all of these different island archipelagos and put together the first book ever written about the mammals of this region. And it's a vast area, you know, Richard. It stretches about the same distances from Beijing to Paris. You know, it's a massive area across the north of Australia, and every island is different from every other one. So you can imagine the fun we had going from one island group to the other doing this survey work.
So you looked at the map, and you looked at the few spotty, moth-eaten specimens that there were from these islands, and it just inflamed your imagination?
Well, that's right. I realised I started work at the Australian Museum in 1984 and was wondering what I should do with this great opportunity. And I realised that no one had written a book on the mammals of that vast region. The museum had some specimens. Some of them were 100 years old, you know, and collected when punitive expeditions were sent out to blow up villages of people who'd eaten white people and whatever else, you know. It's like tremendous stuff.
So, kill everyone in the village and bring back a possum.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's right. So the really old specimens. And there was a few old accounts here and there. And I thought, well, this is a great chance. So the first step of the thing was not to visit the islands themselves, but to go to the world's museums and have a look in these treasure troves of specimens, some of them, you know, over 100 years old, that no one had ever reported on.
This is a huge, as you say, it's a huge stretch of territory, isn't it?
But of course, most of it's ocean, most of it's water. But it's made up of islands that have extraordinarily different histories. Some of them have just popped up above the ocean waves literally yesterday. I mean, you know, others have been there for 90 million years, you know. Some of them have, and the other thing I found amazing about it was these islands actually move in geological time. We think of them as a fixed archipelago, but as you start looking at the animals and plants that live on them, you realise that these are floating arcs. Some of them have moved from close to Australia to where they are today in the middle of the Bismarck Sea. Others have come from, you know, way down south 90 million years ago from Antarctica or New Zealand and have moved up. And that imprint of those travels for the islands is there in the fauna. And of course then the human cultures add another whole dimension to it. If you go to, say, the Bismarck Archipelago north of New Guinea or the Solomon Islands, what you meet there are very ancient cultures of people who share a great deal of similarity with Australia's Aborigines. And they got out to those islands perhaps 30,000 years ago. You know, so they must have had watercraft, quite good ones, to make that journey. But further out from that, when you go to Vanuatu or Fiji or New Caledonia, those islands were only settled about 3,000 years ago by a different group of people. And some of the stories are fascinating. So Fiji's a great example. You know, someone did a study of the DNA of Fijians recently, and they found out that the women all share a mitochondrial DNA, which is the female DNA. It's not passed on through the male line, that is Polynesian in origin. Right, so it's part of the Polynesian culture. The men in Fiji, however, all share in their Y chromosome, the male chromosome, a Melanesian origin. So how do you get a population where the men are all from one origin and the women are all from another? And people have, wondered about this for years. And the only explanation I can see that makes any sense is there must have been a Polynesian canoe passing through the Melanesian islands, New Guinea and whatever, And you can imagine perhaps it came ashore ill-advisedly and, the men were all caught out and the canoe was taken over by Melanesian men and then sailed off into the Pacific. So the canoe had...
So the men were all killed, the Polynesian men were all killed, the women were kept and then used for their nefarious purposes.
Presumably, and discovered a whole new island archipelago, discovered the Fiji Islands and settled it. So who knows how this happened, but when you start looking back at the history of these islands, they really are fascinating. Really
I think you say in your book that the Polynesian people came out of Taiwan originally. I'm just trying to think of the kind of seafaring feats that they must have been able to achieve to cover those vast distances in what I suppose would look to us as primitive seafaring craft.
Well, if you look back at that, they came out of Taiwan 6,000 years ago. By 3,000 years ago, they were into the Pacific Islands. By 900 years ago, they'd colonised, virtually every island between Madagascar off Africa's coast and Henderson Island, which is quite close to the South American mainland. And, way down to New Zealand, the whole Hawaii in the north. They'd covered 2/3 of the globe, those people, before... Europeans had developed a decent ship of any sort, really. I mean, I'm astonished. And James Cook said it all, when James Cook went to Hawaii and met these people, he said, there we were in the little Endeavour, surrounded by these canoes that were bigger than my ship, far more agile, faster, could carry more material, and were just superior in every way.
Canoes that were bigger than the Endeavour?
Longer, yes, these huge canoes they use for inter-island travelling, ocean going. Amazing.
As you say, some of these islands are just chips off a larger island or a continent or something. And other islands are volcanic, and so that they have these mountain peaks. Did you look at some of those mountain peaks from afar in Australia before you left and wondering what's up the top?
Well, I did, and you start to classify islands because we had to work out where to spend our time. Some islands were inherently more interesting than others. The volcanic ones, unless they were very old, by and large aren't quite as interesting because, as you can imagine, Richard, they come out of the ocean with nothing on them. I mean, there's no life on them. And then it takes many millions of years, if that's a distant island, for animals and plants to reach it and colonise it. But if an island is an ancient chip off a continent, for example, that has become separated, it enters its island phase with a full complement of fauna and flora, which then goes on to evolve in its own particular way. So the volcanic ones were interesting, but even more interesting to me were the chips off the old continental blocks, that had lots of fascinating things on them.
Tim, you say that these islands tend to produce animals that you describe as naive. What do you mean by that?
Well, it's really striking when you go out to these islands that the animals and even the plants that live there don't have the defences that things on a mainland do. So, for example, many of the birds are flightless, and even animals that are potentially rather ferocious, like a metre-long rat, native rat, and these are huge, gigantic rats. They just won't attempt to bite you, even when you handle them, and it's because they're never hunted by anything. The islands are too small to have top predators on them. So these animals are very docile, very tame, and even the monkey-faced bats, which have got a wingspan of a metre, and they could take your finger off if they wanted. You can handle them without any problems, and it was really striking as a biologist actually to see this again and again.
Why does the evolutionary process actually work in favour of docile animals in these places?
Well, I guess every living organism has a potential energy budget, a certain amount of energy it can spend in one way or the other. On a mainland, a continent, you're really well positioned if you put aside a part of that energy budget to defend yourself against predators, and put aside another part for reproduction. But on an island where there are no predators, then individual organisms that do that are at a disadvantage compared with those that say, right, putting 100% of the budget into reproduction. Don't need to fly, don't need to do anything else. Just need to have lots of offspring, because in an evolutionary sense, those where there are no predators, those organisms will be better off. So islands do something very strange in an evolutionary sense. It's almost like a Alice Through the Looking Glass world, really, where the rules of evolution are all inverted. They're all different.
So it's like a survivalist couple who go up into the mountains, never have any children, spend all their money and effort building a fortress, and then they die without any kids. Meanwhile, down the hill, someone's having lots of babies and then their children go on to thrive, in other words.
That's it.
That's pretty much
Yeah,
it.
I
Is
reckon you got it in one there,
That's it.
Richard.
The survivalists don't get it on. Did you see? Are there examples of animals? Maybe I'm getting ahead of myself here. Examples who had given a fair chunk of their energy budget to survivalist adaptations, that having then drifted off onto one of these islands, just lost it.
Look, there are lots of examples of that, and but it particularly relates to behaviours. That's what I saw. I mean, some of the island animals might be a bit slower than the mainland counterparts and perhaps live on the ground rather than seeking a refuge in the trees. But most of what I saw was about behaviours. And, you know, if you approach a kangaroo in Australia, for example, or a possum, they're quite often likely to flee from you, to run. And that involves quite a big energetic expenditure, you know, to get away from you. They might have been drinking or eating or doing something else that has to be interrupted. They run off. They'll keep going quite a way. A lot of island creatures will just sort of look at you.
Yeah, how docile do they get? Like, do they remain docile even while being attacked?
Some of the most extreme examples are the birds, like albatrosses, and they are so devoted to brooding their eggs on their nest that, you know, if you introduce rats onto their islands, the rats can literally eat those birds alive without the birds retaliating, because they're just sitting on their nest brooding their eggs. And it's one of the things that makes island life so vulnerable.
I just wonder what's, if you can say the bird has a mind of such, what's going through the bird's mind while it's being gnawed alive by a rat. Nonetheless, I must stay here.
Yeah, who knows?
Who knows?
But you know, what we do know is that evolution has favoured those birds that look after those eggs come hell or high water.
There's bats on these islands, and you love your bats, don't you?
I do. I'm very fond of my bats. Yeah. And in fact, they're the major form of mammal on the islands because, of course, they can fly out to them. The others, possums and rats, have to, catch a lift on a log or something. So it's a much more chancy process for them.
Tim Flannery is my guest in conversation. His latest book is a memoir of his passionate youth and his trip amongst the islands of the South Pacific, and it's called Among the Islands, Adventures in the Pacific. Your first stop was to go to Woodlark Island in the Trobriands, which are, really fabled islands. They're beautiful, famous places. How did you travel to the Woodlark Island from Australia? Tell me about the voyage.
Well, at that point, there was no airstrip or usable airstrip on Woodlark Island and no air service. And this is a very large island and covered in pristine primary forest. So we really had no choice. I had to charter a boat. A catamaran is what we used from the Australian Museum. Had one based at Lizard Island in Queensland. And we got together a group of people who wanted to go and see the Pacific. The Australian Museum Society was kind enough to advertise that I was hoping to do this expedition, and we got along a group of people who helped contribute to defray the costs and come with us. And we had a ball. It was amazing. Wow, the skipper of the boat was a tremendous man. Matt Jumalet, his name was. He's now passed away, unfortunately, but what an adventurous life that guy had. I mean, I think he'd been a submariner in the Second World War and then joined the Merchant Navy and then joined Burns Philp, the great trading company in PNG, and I think he'd skippered everything from an inter-island ferry through to the biggest vessel they had in the fleet. And so he was our captain, and he was very captainly. He was very good at keeping order. It was
his boat, was it? Right.
It was his boat, absolutely. You knew that from the start, but tremendous bloke.
So once you get out past the Great Barrier Reef, you hit the Coral Sea, and then that's when you hit the high seas, don't you? And there's a fair bit of pitch and roll and the like. Nonetheless, what kind of things do you see on a voyage out when you're out at night? Under the stars. Paint me a bit of a picture of what that's like.
Well, it's, I'd never made a voyage like that before. It was a 4-day crossing from Australia to New Guinea for us. And it was the season of the southeast trade. So there was there was a constant wind with quite a bit of waves. And I remember when we crossed outside the Great Barrier Reef, I was asleep. But I had this dream that I was going down, down, down into Davy Jones' locker and just not coming up, And we'd obviously hit a wave, and somehow the brain had confused the signal. So I leapt out of bed and went up and saw Matt up in his area up there and on the bridge. And I just sat out and looked at the stars because I'd never seen the stars so clearly. There was no light on the horizon. It was just this canopy of stars, absolutely clear sky. There was phosphorescence in the water, so behind the boat you see this trail of phosphorescence. And
what creates that light under the water?
Look, as far as I understand, it's small organisms, sea jellies, or these sort of things that once they're disturbed, if something the current goes past, they will emit this light, and so you see them behind the boat, the wake of the boat glows, So you can imagine this starlit sky and the wake just glowing. And then every now and again, a fish or a dolphin coming towards the boat like a torpedo, because it's lit up too, and you just see his light coming straight towards the boat as the dolphin wants to ride the wake, Quite amazing.
Were you sick?
No, I was lucky.
You got your sea legs.
I got my sea legs pretty quickly, but a few other members of the expedition were really martyrs to seasickness in the most gruesome way. Anyway, thank heavens I escaped that.
You arrive at Woodlark Island there, and that had once been a vast American base in the war in the Pacific. Is there any sign of that still when you were there, or had the jungle just taken it back?
No, there was still. It was the 1980s, and it was only 50 years after the war. So the airstrip was still there. The jungle was growing up through it, but people were still using that area as a I suppose for their village. And there was lots and lots of stuff. People up in the Pacific, they still dig up these amazing treasure troves of I suppose, materiel from the war. When we were on Manus Island, for example, people were saying that just a week or two before we arrived, they dug up this tremendous cache of roofing iron, corrugated roofing iron, which they said was far superior to the stuff you'd buy in the store today. It was all wrapped in these waxed tarpaulins and was in beautiful condition. So for them, it was an absolute find.
What were you looking for on Woodlark Island? What were you hoping to find?
Well, Woodlark had only had 2 biological expeditions that had gone to that place over the 100 years preceding us arriving. One of them was very, very limited. The other one was perhaps a week. So we didn't know what to expect on Woodlark. We could have, we wouldn't have been surprised to find anything. But the one animal we did know that was there, which was extremely interesting, was a possum called the Woodlark Spotted Cuscus, which is the strangest looking possum I've ever seen in my life.
I love that too. I'm off to the Trobriands to look for the Woodlark Spotted Cuscus.
That's right.
What was you?
Yeah, exactly. It was good. Actually, it was good fun in the pub before we left next to the museum. They're telling everyone what we're going to do. But yeah, this animal's really strange because each individual looks different from the other. They're a bit like cats, tabby cats, how the pattern's different on each one. And again, we just don't know why that is. And when we began work there, we knew nothing about that animal. We didn't have any idea whether it was rare or common, what sort of habitat it lived in, what its reproduction rates were like. There's still lots of mysteries about it, but at least we got some of the basic biology down.
What really strikes me as reading about your account of this is you'd already spent quite a bit of time in New Guinea, and that was the subject of your book, Throw Away Leg, the one that precedes this. You seem to be reasonably adept for someone with no training in village diplomacy. I mean, when you arrive in these places, you have to make contact with the village chief or the elder and explain yourself, I suppose. Just tell me about that process. Is there a common approach for these places, Tim?
There's no common approach, but it's always wise to understand that people see you as the main chance as well, right? So you're going there to do a job, but they can see some advantages of having you there as well. And on Woodlark, we had a very funny situation arise. That area is what's called part of the Kula Ring. And the Kula Ring is off southeast New Guinea. It's a trade system where people trade these shell valuables. And when someone dies, these shell valuables are buried with them in a usually a tomb or a cave or something.
So shells are like gold to them?
They're a sort of a manufactured thing. A shell is incorporated into this valuable object, which is like money, really, for them. So the equivalent would be, a rich person dies and all of their money is put in a box and put in their grave with them. So you can imagine the situation on the island.
So it's essentially useless but beautiful, in other words.
That's right, yes. Yeah, but and tremendously valuable if you get your hands on these things. But people are very suspicious of ghosts in this area. So anyway, I turned up on a village on Woodlark and said, look, I want to go and have a look at some caves to the village headman. He said, yes, I can take you to some caves. Of course, the cogs are turning in his mind. He goes, I know some caves where there's some shell valuables we can take this bloke out to. So anyway, I'd sort of forgotten about this, but next morning there he was with his car, first thing in the morning, so let's go to the caves. So
why won't he go into the cave?
Well, he's scared of the ghosts, to be haunted forever if you disturb, Granddad's shell valuables. I mean, it could be the end of you, But for me, this innocent outsider, I'd be fine. So anyway.
Go on, white guy, get in that cave.
Exactly. So we drive off into the bush, and he sits in the car very firmly. He said, they're over there somewhere. And I said, well, where? He said, just over there, just keep walking. Terribly dense scrub, no one had been here presumably forever. So I'm wandering about like the Lost Tribes of Israel for hours, covered in ants and leeches and everything, you know. And I finally find this cave, which had collapsed, unfortunately, and so there was no bats, and I couldn't find much in the way of shell valuables either. But he did say to me, he said, you know, if you find the shell valuables, he said, just come back to the car, put them in the back. Whatever you do, don't put them in the cabin with me. Keep them in the back with you. And he said, when we get back to the village, put them down beside my hut. And if they're still there in the morning, I'll know that the ancestors want me to have them, you see, and I'll be a rich man.
So how did he respond when you came back to the Jeep without these valuable Kula shells?
Well, I must have looked a fright when I came back. I was all torn about with different, you know, things, and was sweating, obviously, and sort of loping along through the bush.
And angry.
And angry. And he took one look at me. He was just about to take off. I think he thought I'd been possessed by the spirits. I was ready to dash back. Thank heavens he waited a second I could get there and tell him that I hadn't been possessed by demons, but I was just wasn't bothered. Anyway.
Tim, tell me about your adventures with snakes on Woodlark Island.
Well, look, one of my best mates at the museum in Sydney was the snake expert. And I'd convinced him to come along on this trip with me. But he said, look, I can't get there for the first week or so. I've got some other commitments. So would you mind holding on to any snakes people bring in, you know? And I thought, oh, that's easy enough. Not thinking too seriously about this, you know. But, of course, once we got to Woodlark Island, this idea that the snake, Master Belong Snake, as they called him, the snake expert was arriving any day, had the whole blooming village out there looking for the most deadly, venomous, horrible-looking reptiles that you could imagine. And they brought them all in. I'd ran out of bags in the end. I had these canvas bags.
So they were bringing to you in bags, these snakes in bags?
No, I had to get them into the bags.
So villagers are coming to you with snakes,
yeah,
essentially?
Tied to poles, usually, with bush rope, and you have to sort of undo them bit by bit and hope not to get bitten. Throw the damn thing into the bag and tie it and hope it'll be okay. I remember one day, you know, half the village was trooping along behind this bloke with this stick with this most horrible-looking snake on it, about 3 metres long. And I thought, oh, God.
3 metres long?
Yes, right. Just one. And it was clearly not a python. This was something venomous. Yeah.
3 metres long and not a python.
Yes,
right.
And I don't know my snakes very well, but this thing, I could just tell that it was not a very nice animal. Anyway, I managed to get it into this bag. It was very strong as well. Threw it into this bag, the biggest one we had, tied it up and hung it up in the accommodation that we were in. And I remember I got back into bed about 1 a.m. one morning, fell soundly asleep and awoke to this sound. I thought we were being attacked by rascals or something, but what had happened was this snake had got about half of its body out through a hole in the canvas bag and was swinging around above our head. You know, the only thing it was holding in was a bulge. It must have eaten a cat or something, because it was like there was a bulge halfway down it that was sort of preventing it getting out of the hole. It's funny, I was there with the torch. All I could find was a thong, so I had to pin this thing to the wall with a thong, then get another bag and just throw the whole thing in and pray like hell that this snake expert was going to turn up the next day, because I was by then heartily sick of dealing with these blooming things, I can tell you.
Tim Flannery, non-herpetologist but a pretty good scientist on all other matters, is my guest in conversation at the moment. His new book is called Among the Islands, Adventures in the Pacific. It's the story about his adventures on the islands of the Pacific as a young man about 25 years ago. You went to Goodenough Island there, and what did you hope to find on Goodenough Island? Tell me about that place too.
Well, Goodenough is an extraordinary place. It's one of the highest islands in the region. It's the mountain on the summit there is higher than Mount Kosciuszko. So you can imagine, it's only a small island. Who's heard of Goodenough? Yeah, to be 100 kilometres across or less, you know. But it just goes up like a spire.
So its tallest point is taller than anywhere in Australia on this island.
That's right. This tiny little island, yeah. And, you know, when you climb that mountain in the middle of the island, you realise that there's these extraordinary habitats preserved there. So you go up through a tropical grassland first, then you get into what's called an oak forest, which is a forest of gigantic tropical oak trees, you know, the sort of things you see maybe in Southeast Asia in the tropics, and then into a beech forest at the top. So above that, things like you might see in Tasmania or Chile or something.
Is it cold up there?
Yeah, it is. It really is cold up there. And of course, the rivers and streams that flow from that peak are frigid, because, you know, you're right high up, and you know, there's things stay cold.
What were you hoping to find there?
Well, again, we knew very little about that island. The one thing we knew that lived there, which was of great interest to us, was a wallaby.
What's a wallaby doing on that island? That's a long way from Australia.
I know. It was extraordinary. And how long's it been out there for? Isolated? What are its nearest relatives? You know, it turns out that this thing, we found some fossils very similar to the teeth of these animals down in South Australia. These fossils are 4 million years old from the Murray River. What's today the Murray River? So somehow this creature, or relatives of this animal, was once widespread throughout Australia, and today it's just restricted to the high peak of this one mountain.
So what makes this wallaby different from the average one we've got hopping about the place in Australia?
It is the most beautiful looking animal. It's got a very dense plush and soft fur because, of course, it's so cold. And if you look at it, from a distance, it just looks black. But if you turn the fur back, so brush it against the grain, you see the underfur's all white. So when they move, you get this cracking of the fur, and the black gives way to white, and it's a very beautiful animal. Really extraordinary thing. And what's really weird about it, Richard, is that you know how most kangaroos, their tail lays on the ground like a sort of an L-shaped, I suppose. Yeah. Well, this one does it the opposite way. So the tail sticks straight out and then goes down, just the tip sits on the ground.
Why? What's the benefit in that you can see?
Well, we think it's to do with the number of leeches in New Guinea. There's a lot of leeches up there. And I guess the less tail you expose to the ground, the more chance you've got of avoiding leeches. But
it's fascinating with natural selection. There's a rationale for kind of everything like that you observe like that. It's fascinating.
Yeah, well, look, some of it is just so stories. We do our best to try to understand. But, they're clearly, things are that way for a purpose.
You're listening to Conversations with Richard Fadler on ABC Local Radio. On air, online and podcast.
Today on Conversations, Tim Flannery returns to tell the story of his passionate youth in the 1980s. Tim went on a journey with the Australian Museum in Sydney to go to the islands of the Pacific to investigate the mammals that were there. These were places that had the scantest documentation at the time. They were largely mysterious to scientists like Tim. Just a moment ago, we were talking about you going to Goodenough Island to find the wallaby. I believe it was called the black gazelle-headed wallaby, and that meant you had to climb the mountain that's taller than Mount Kosciuszko, right in the middle of Goodenough Island. Tell me about climbing that mountain.
Well, we arrived on Goodenough during a horrible drought. There was no food on the island. People were pretty listless. There was a lot of illness. So we got off the plane and I went and introduced myself to the village headman again and said, look, we'd like to climb up the mountain. Could we employ someone to come with us? And he got together 3 or 4 young kids, early teenage kids, and just said, they'll take you up there. So we're walking up and I say to them, how far is it? And one of them says, about an hour and a half. Seemed rather ambitious, but nevertheless it was plausible, Anyway, we go further, and honestly, that day, it was a hot day. We're in tropical grassland that's all been burnt, and we didn't carry enough water with us because we didn't know how far this was. And we were just going all day. Finally got to the kind of ridge crest, and we looked up, and there was another 600 metres or so of this same stuff going up. And I was honestly on my last legs by that stage. I turned to one of the kids and said, you sure it was only 1.5 hours? And they all talked among themselves. I said, no, we don't know. And I said, why not? I said, we've never been there before. And they said, our uncle just sent us up because we didn't have any tucker and we thought we could have some of yours. So anyway, that's all right. But anyway, we did make it.
Yeah. So once you finally got up through this furnace, the side of the mountain, and you finally reached the forest, paint me a picture of what that forest was like.
Well, you can imagine walking for 2 days through this, just relentlessly steep and difficult landscape, and then crossing a ridge where you go into this dark forest of magnificent trees, these tropical oaks, huge things, 1 metre across the bowl, and you're in this wonderland. And we walked on for a couple of hours, came to this valley of this stream, which was very steep, and it was cascading over these huge boulders with the trees covered in wisps of this like Spanish moss, very strange. I haven't seen it elsewhere in New Guinea, but this very eerie sort of environment.
Well, like you see in Gone with the Wind, like Deep South kind of environment.
Yeah, exactly, so like
what
that.
Are the billows in the wind and
although there was very little wind, that was just hanging in wisps, and the bird noise was like nothing I'd ever heard. There was this very deep sort of trumpet-like note. It turned out that was a bird unique to the island called the curl-crested maniacode. It's a relative of the birds of paradise, but it produces this uncanny sound, and the windpipe of the bird just wraps around and around and around its chest muscle. I saw it later. So you can imagine this weird environment. And then we went a bit further and found this cave, which was I think, one of the most extraordinary places I've ever camped. This was a boulder of granite that would have been the size of my house in Sydney, just sitting in the forest with other boulders around it beside this stream, but propped up by 3 smaller boulders on its corners. And you had to literally crawl in under this space, and you were out of the rain then, and you could light a fire and whatever and sleep. But the best place to sleep was, the boulder was probably only about, 20 centimetres above your nose, when you lay down there. And it was this extraordinary feeling of just being in this elfin woodland, I'd call it. It was like being something out of the Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, the Forest of Fangorn is what it sounds like to me.
Yes. But, I went out the next morning and I remember sitting beside the stream, brushing my teeth, and this bird just came down the stream. It was a Brahminy kite. Beautiful thing, white breast, brownish coloured back. And it flew, because it was such a narrow pass through the trees and things, it was forced to fly right past me. And I don't know whether you've ever seen a bird of prey fly within a metre of your nose, Richard, and look at you as it goes slowly down. It was just magical. I thought, this place is unlike anywhere else I've ever been.
So, did you find this black gazelle-headed wallaby?
Look, I did. The first week, we saw abundant signs of it. We found its droppings and, paths through the forest and whatever, but could never see an animal. And then a hunter came up. He was an old man with one arm and these dogs. And the dogs had a special magic. They were the only ones that could catch the wallaby. He went out, he wanted to feed, heard we were up there, but decided he wanted some wallabies to eat. Sent the dogs out and caught a couple which he ate and which we could then sample for our biological work.
So you not only had sample, you ate this wallaby?
I'm afraid to say, Richard, I did. We were starving by this stage. I know it's no excuse, but, when you've been out in the bush that long and we're sharing our food with these 4 teenagers who were eating like horses, we had nothing left. I mean, I was desperate.
These teenagers who turned out to be dead weight.
They did a bit.
Dead weight on your mission.
I was just about gnawing on my arm towards the end of that trip. But
was it pleasant to the taste?
It was fantastic. This old man had brought up a woman with him. I think it was his wife. She made an earth oven, really, a stone oven, with all of these ferns that she'd collected and heated these rocks, put them into this stone oven, wrapped the meat in these fern leaves and things, and it was magnificent. It was really beautiful. It was really good.
It was really
I don't
good.
think it was just that I was hungry. It was really good.
It's gourmet food at the top of a good enough mountain.
I know, a rare wallaby. I know I shouldn't admit it.
Was it a little odd, though? We're eating this rare, and endangered animal. Was it rare? Was it odd for you to be eating it? I know you had mixed feelings eating it, didn't you?
I really did, because I thought, is it right? Should we do it? But we really had no choice. We wanted to stay up there long enough to complete the survey. The animals were dead anyway. This guy was hunting, and that's why he was up there, was to get some food. And of course, we kept the skeletons, for the museum collection. So that was something.
On Manus Island, you were looking for the special kind of rats. What kind of rats?
There was 2 kinds of rats known on the island. One was a reddish rat, which is a tree-climbing species. The other one was a terrestrial, ground-dwelling rat that's much more like the sort of rats that you might have around your house. But the red one we found, it was a unique species, only found on the island. And it was great to be the first scientist, I guess, to lay eyes on that animal and to know a little bit then about the history of the islands and think about how it got there. It's always a privilege. When you are that first, and I was out hunting alone that night, I was out in the forest alone. I was the only one who saw it there. It was really, really special.
Once you'd caught this rat, how big was it?
It was about as long as my hand. So quite a fat little fellow. Too.
Oh, like the size of a small cat, in other words.
Yeah, kitten-sized, yeah.
Oh.
In the Solomons, we found much bigger rats than that, though. We were getting up to nearly the metre long and a couple of kilograms in the Solomons. So.
Nearly a metre long?
Yeah. There was one rat there that I could not believe, called a Poncelet Giant Rat. This thing, it's like 2/3 of a metre long, black fur. It's got a Mohican hairstyle. It's got a ridge, a crest that sits up over the head and neck, and is bald on the sides. And it lives in the top of the biggest rainforest trees in the entire region. And it builds a nest like a sea eagle's nest up in these trees.
Is it fierce or docile?
Docile. It really is a docile creature. I mean, a house rat, is much more likely to bite you than this gigantic Solomon.
Is there something about islands that tends to get small animals to grow larger and large animals to grow smaller? Do they all end up the size of a pig or a cat or something? Is that what normally happens on these islands?
Well, again, that's one of the weirdest things about islands, is that really big animals like elephants, we know from the fossil record, they tend to dwarf.
where are dwarf elephants?
Look, there's a number of the Mediterranean islands had dwarf elephants on them. The island of Timor had one. The island of Flores in Indonesia.
How small?
Well, some of them were only a metre high, and they would have coexisted in some cases with hedgehogs that were almost the same size, because hedgehogs, being small animals, got bigger.
That's adorable. I want one. There are none left, though, are there?
No.
So rats get really big on islands, and elephants tend to get really small.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Why? Do we know why?
Well, look, there's various theories about it, but, one theory is that, of course, the elephants get small because on a small landmass there is very limited food resources and so forth, and therefore dwarfed individuals are advantaged. But for the rats, I guess they're filling vacant ecological niches. There's nothing like possums, for example, wasn't in the past in the Solomons. So, rats could become possum-like. And, of course, the bats are the really weird ones with that. The monkey-faced bats, my favourite creatures.
Yeah. Now, it's funny you should say that. I was just getting onto bats. Yeah. You went bat hunting in New Ireland, and there's a story there of you going into a cave and experiencing perfect bat horror. This is kind of anyone's worst bat nightmare, really. Tim, explain what happened and what you were looking for.
Well, look, I was trying to do a survey of the bats of the region, and local people said, there's a great cave over there full of bats, interesting bats. And I remember going into this place, and, even outside, you can hear the screaming and screeching of 1 million bats, or however many there was inside. And these weren't small bats either. These are fruit bats, so they're the size of a kitten, these bats, and they stink. So anyway, I go into this cave, and it's like a cathedral. You put your torch up to the roof, and you can see tens of thousands of eyes looking down at you from the ceiling. Lower the torch, and there is the cesspit that they've all been pooing into for the last 5,000 years, as far as I can tell.
Well, this is like a giant cone of bat guano?
Cone of bat guano, which is being worked over by worms and beetles and maggots and every sort of horrible thing. You see, the surface is moving with this stuff, right?
How big a cone are we talking about here?
I would reckon this one would have been 10 metres high at least.
A 10-metre cone of bat guano, which is writhing.
Yes, and I thought I'd save myself a lot of trouble, because I looked up at the bats and thought, I know those bats, they're a very common species, we've collected them outside the cave, I'm not going to bother. But then I was unfortunate enough to put the torch to the far rear wall of the cave, where I could see these much smaller bats flitting about just in the gloom, and realised, actually, I've got to find out what they are. I can't have come all this way and then turn back at the last. So I started up this bloomin' bat dropping mountain, which was shocking. I mean, my boots just sunk into it. Sorry,
you had to climb over the mountain?
Yes, because you're slogging up it, and your boots are filling with bat guano and these beetles and maggots and things all squirming around. It was horrible. But anyway, I thought I've had worse. So anyway, went down the other side, and then I realised that the back of the cave had been cut off by this lake of bat piss, basically. So I thought, oh, God. Well, having come so far, it's difficult to turn back now. So I started wading in, and that feeling, you get sort of about a third of the way, and you're not quite sure how deep it's going to get. So anyway, it had got to about waist deep, and I thought, no. But anyway, I kept going, and finally it got shallower again, thank heavens. I got to the other side, to the end of the bloomin' bat cave, and these bats I'd seen turned out to be the commonest species of small bat in the whole region. So one look at them and I thought, that's it, I've seen one I need to see. But anyway, so
when you've climbed a mountain and walked through a lagoon of bat filth,
yes,
and it's rising up against you, and it's gone behind your boots,
yes,
and then up to your thighs, did you you're making deals with yourself the whole time, aren't you? At some point you're saying, there must have been a point where you said, if it gets this high on me, I'm going back.
Well, there was, but you've got to weigh it all. I've come all the way from Australia. I've got all the grant money together. I've spent weeks getting here.
No.
Would you turn back when you're 10 metres away, Richard?
Yes, I would. I'd never go there in the first place. And this has proved to me, Tim Flannery, that science is a disease. Science is a kind of mania, really. It's a form of mental illness, essentially.
It can become that, I'm afraid, at times.
So the bat was unremarkable anyway.
It was, I know, terrible. Anyway.
Nonetheless, you did find some remarkable and beautiful bats on this island, and you took them to a village elder called Sanaila Talavat to identify. Paint a portrait of this remarkable man.
He was in his 80s when I met him. He had been the Premier of the province of New Ireland. He'd been educated at a German primary school, so he spoke some German. And he had the most splendid side whiskers I have ever seen outside of 19th century photographs from the fatherland. And he was a chronic chewer of betel nut. So, people who chew betel nut have a bright red mouth, meaning because, it's a reddish stain. That
like
leaves.
Bloody Mary in South Pacific.
That's right, yes. It's exactly. He was so touched that we were interested in the history of the island and the animals on the island. And he was really probably the last person in the area who remembered all the traditional names for the animals. So every morning I'd bring the bats that we'd caught in our nets and things in and show them to him. And, he'd pull one out and he'd handle it so gently and just look at it. And you could see in his eyes that he was going back to an earlier period when he was a young man who hunted and things. And then he'd say something like, Amanda ilawana aflas, the bat whose fur has been touched by the sea. And that's the name of this particular bat,
And why would it be called the bat whose fur has been touched by the sea?
Well, that particular species had a greenish tinge on the fur. It quite unusual feature. But, that was the native name for it. I was so pleased to be able to write them down and record them because they're lost now, But a future generation of New Islanders might want that information,
Tim Flannery is here, the author of Among the Islands, Adventures in the Pacific, his adventures in the 1980s on the islands, looking for the exotic and rare mammals living on these islands. In the Solomon Islands, you went looking for monkey-faced bats. Tell me about the people you visited on the weather coast of Guadalcanal who had a kind of millennial cult there. They were expecting the end of the world to come about.
Well, they were. Guadalcanal is the island in the Solomons which has the capital on it, but it's also an area with the most remote tribes, most remote regions. You cross over these immensely high mountains onto the weather coast and you're in another world. These people have had very little contact with the outside world. A couple of young men, however, had walked across the mountain, gone into Honiara and seen these movies that were being shown by American evangelists. And that included stories of the rapture. I don't know whether you know about this, Richard, but the idea that when the end of the world comes, all of the good people will be taken up to heaven and the bad people will be left. So if the pilot of your aircraft is a good person, 737, he'll be sucked up and all of the bad people will just be left to crash.
That's right. There'll be fire and the streets will be blood will run out of our eyeballs and we'll be crushed by hailstones the size of Volkswagens, that kind of thing, yeah.
Exactly. Well, you can imagine these young men having come from a very remote village into Honiara and seen this. They don't have the discrimination to know whether this is true, whether this
context.
is going to happen. They don't have the context exactly. So when they went back to the village, of course, this was the great story. And this was in the mid-1990s, so the end of the world, as far as they were concerned, was going to come in 2000. The end of 2000, that was it. And I was really concerned for them because I thought if they really believe this, they're going to stop making their gardens, and without gardens, they're going to starve.
Did you try to persuade them otherwise?
I really did, but to no avail. I mean, how do you explain to someone that this stuff that you've seen about the rapture is the invention of some crack-brained American cults?
Tim, you've been to a lot of these places like New Guinea, which was some of the last places in the world, the modern world, the rest of the modern world has touched. I sometimes think for them, and I'm sure you have a much better perspective on it than me, that it must have been like for the rest of us to wake up one day and the skies are full of alien spacecraft and of another order of technological advancement and a culture that seems completely weird and alien to us. Is that a good analogy for what the people on a lot of these islands experienced once the modern world started to reach out and touch them, and more than touch them?
Yeah, look, absolutely, it is. And of course, what aspect of the modern world reaches those people is random. There's a whole lot of things that can affect them. I remember one village I went to on the island of Malaita, which had remained insulated from the modern world for about 70 years because of a massacre that occurred there in the 1920s. An Australian and a couple of Brits and some others were killed by the local people there. And as a result, the colonial administration armed the enemies of these people, sent them in and massacred them. And those villagers said, we've had it with the outside world, that is it, no more. And I was very lucky to go there in 1989. And I remember walking up this slope as it is, got into the interior of the mountain with my pack on, and this vision just floated past me, and it was a young girl, 16 years old, 17 years old, totally naked, with a corncob pipe in her mouth that she just puffed by. She stopped beside us, picked up my pack, which I'd put down, put it on her back, and just puffed up the mountain. And I thought, what in heaven's name is going on here? And We got into this village and it was totally traditional. In that area, before marriage, women are not allowed to wear a stitch of clothing. And they are totally unabashed, Richard. There's no false modesty or anything. Completely, this is just the normal state of things. And it's so wonderful, actually.
Is this one of these fabled places that practices, sexual hospitality, or is it just the opposite?
The opposite. Extremely strict sexual taboos. But you can imagine me as a young man there, kind of going up into the village every day. Right. And I've gone out hunting. I've got myself some flying foxes.
These women are beautiful,
adorable, absolutely. And the corncob pipe even.
I know. That's charming and beautiful all at once. Yeah.
But then there I am skinning my bat. And of course everyone's intrigued. They've got to come around and see what this is. So you try to concentrate. You've got a very sharp scalpel blade in your hand. You're trying to do this work, and there's a breast resting on your shoulder, or a sort of a groin pushing into your back. As kind of the crowd gets denser and denser.
Tim, you're only human.
I know. I ended up having to say to the bloke who'd come with me, "Could you please distract everyone? I'm going to put this scalpel through my hand unless something is done here."
So why were they so confident they could walk around naked and remain unmolested?
I guess that look, in that society, if a woman is seduced or whatever, the guy gets a spear through the ribs or an arrow through the ribs. So they know they're safe in that society. I couldn't begin to understand exactly what's going on in their head, but they were totally unabashed, and it was wonderful to see, actually, which made me think maybe our society's got something to learn from.
I was going to say, Tim, do you think if we had spearing laws in this country, women might feel more confident about walking around naked? I just wonder. Maybe?
Yeah, maybe they would. I don't know. Anyway, this is one.
Zero.
I'm a biologist, Richard, not a social scientist. I don't get me onto that. I don't tell you what.
Just asking you as a human being. As a red-blooded man.
Yes, exactly.
And then there's cannibalism in this part of the world as well. Why cannibalism here and not elsewhere, do you think?
Look, there was some cannibalism in these areas, but really, when you get to Fiji's, when you see cannibalism, big time there. And there was one chief there, Chief Erde, who I think ate nearly 975 people or something.
My God!
Which was,
what? Really?
Yeah, he did. He kept a stone for each one. He had a line of stones in front of his hut for everyone he'd eaten. And of course, the traditional commoner's greeting for a chief in Fiji was "eat me." That was how you'd greet someone who was your social superior. But I did wonder about why cannibalism was so widespread in the islands. And, if you take a biological perspective on this and shed the cultural horror that we have of the practice and just think of it as a practice and think, well, there's obviously a benefit to cannibalism, isn't there? You get some food, but there's also a cost. And that cost might be disease transmission. It might be payback from someone else. But you can imagine a situation where the costs are actually started to reduce, like on an island where diseases are relatively rare because they die out. The population isn't big enough to maintain some of these diseases. The costs of cannibalism may be less, And also on an island, protein is really rare, as I found out on Good Enough and so forth. So the benefits of cannibalism may be proportionally increased.
It's interesting. I think the taboo against cannibalism is a bit like the taboo against incest. It seems to be really deeply ingrained and almost universal. It's just interesting to wonder why it would pop up. When we've heard stories of modern-day cannibalism, it's been like situations where, like that air crash in the Andes, where it's absolutely, completely necessary, or it's seen to be completely necessary, and it overrides that very powerful taboo. I wonder what it does to the society to actually have a cultural practice that seems to overcome an ingrained human taboo like that.
Yeah, well, that's a really good question.
I'm not even sure if you have an answer to that question.
I don't really, but from what I've read of the historical accounts of that practice in the islands, often people were eating their enemies, who you would regard as barely human anyway. Perhaps there's that distance gives you some buffer against the horror of it. I don't know, but some of the accounts, as you saw in the book, are pretty graphic there.
One of the things that really makes you think very hard about, all sorts of things, is the account you've got. You refer to an account of a tradition in Fiji that when the chief would die, all of his wives would have to be killed. Explain how this account described how all the wives would be killed.
Well, that was a remarkable account. And I should explain, Richard, when I was reading this account for the first time, I was living in the village where these events occurred, right, in Fiji. And this old chief... a missionary had befriended him, and the news came to the missionary one day that the chief had died. So the missionary went to pay his respects, and he came into the chief's home just at the moment that all of his wives were being strangled. And they're being strangled by a cloth which was put around their neck and then pulled on by their relatives, by these men. And the women, I guess they seemed pretty resigned to their fate, but the missionary, he wasn't having any of this, and he said, look, I don't think it's right. We shouldn't kill all of these women. Finally prevailed on the situation, at which one of the wives said, but who's going to strangle me? I want to... And he said, he had to make up a story. He said, look, there's no one of high enough status to strangle you, madam, here. You actually can't be done. So anyway, so she got... But then he went to pay his respects to the chief's body. And when he gets there's the chief sitting up in bed having a cup of tea or something, coughing into a handkerchief.
Well, he wasn't dead.
He wasn't dead, yes. So he met the chief's son, and before the missionary could say anything, the chief's son said, oh, I'm so glad you've come here to pay respects to father. He said, as you can see, he's dead, although the spirits are still moving. He's still animated, but, the spirit's left. It's just like just the nervous system operating. And, of course, this was a terrible dilemma for the missionary, because if he said, actually, no, the chief isn't dead and you can't bury him, that would mean that perhaps when he really did die, all of the wives would have to be strangled all over again when he wasn't there to save them. So he ended up not saying anything. But it was he said it was too horrible to go to the funeral, but he was told by those who were there that they heard some coughs from deep underground as dirt was put on top. But anyway, so you can imagine sitting there by a kerosene lamp reading this in the very village where all this had happened. It was fantastic.
It's kind of like you saw the last days of a lost world there, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And the place has changed so much, because when I look back now, I think, God, a civil war's been fought in the Solomon Islands in the time since we worked there. There's been a military coup in Fiji. Things have changed dramatically in New Caledonia and Papua New Guinea. I was just hearing the other day, Richard, that in Papua New Guinea, some of the islands I visited, there's now plans for a $1 billion city that the Chinese want to build there. You can understand what they want to do. There's a lot of fish there. There's a lot of forests there, a lot of mineral wealth. You can understand why they'd think about doing that. But the world has changed so dramatically because, when I was on those islands, it was nothing bigger than a grass hut. Now, I think we've seen the transition now for much of that region where Australia used to be the centre, really, that people would look to it increasingly becoming China, now that people are looking to.
Tim, great to see you.